Welcome, 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 welcome. Two more welcomes. Welcome and welcome to everybody joining us for our continuing series where we talk to reporters, writers, columnists, professors, academics, data researchers, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, as long as we can get a insightful perspective from your vantage point. And we want to bring it unedited and unaltered directly to you so that you could do this thing that was popular back when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back. Maybe it won't. With us today is our privilege to have Professor Dr. Brittany Shoots-Reinhard from the Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Psychology. Shoots-Reinhard is interested in decision-making and attitudes and persuasion. One area of her research investigates how perceived and actual numeric ability influences decisions and motivation to ultimately improve academic, healthy, and financial outcomes. Second area involves evidence-based communication and how factors such as emotion, message resistance, good point, and numeric ability facilitate or inhibit persuasion and behavioral change. She has explored these factors in topics such as tobacco use and safe driving, PhD in social psychology from Ohio State, social psychology master's from Ohio State, and a BS in psychology from Ohio State. Some of the selected publications. Despite high objective numeracy, lower numeric confidence relates to worse financial and medical outcomes. Pictorial warning labels and memory for cigarette health risk information over time. Improving numeracy through values affirmation enhances decision and STEM outcomes. Personality, certainty, and politics increasing the predictive utility of individual difference inventives. And not all contrast effects are created equal. Extent of processing affects contrast strength. And disjunction between probability and verdict in junior decision making. She's worked in communicating numeric information funded by the National Science Foundation. She's also worked in the psychology of driving funded by the Risk Institute at Fisher College. Some of her past projects have been RAPID, a longitudinal study of public responses to the coronavirus. We're going to get into that in a little bit. And this is the article where I found the professor. But before we get into that, let's check in and see how I did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Do we need to correct anything with the record at all?
Nope, no corrections. You're good.
Okay, great. All right, then we're going to get right to the meat and potatoes. Here it is. The article was Ability-Related Political Polarization in the COVID-19 Pandemic. It came out in 2021. Just for the audience, why did you do this study and why did you do it in 2021? And before you answer, if you could answer both as an academic and just as somebody living in America with two working eyeballs. And if you could speak to me as if I was in a cave or coma for the last 5 to 7 years, just so that it's coming totally from your vantage point. What's going on in America? Why is this a worthwhile topic? Why should people care? Why did you care? And why was 2021 the year that you got involved?
Absolutely. So it's a funny story because actually it's a story of that I think we don't tell enough in science, where we've started out with one idea and what ended up happening was a little bit different. Like my bio mentions, I work in a lab that we study how people's beliefs and emotions influence decision making. And we kind of saw COVID-19 start to bubble up. So there's this virus that seems to be scary. So we thought, in decision making, we study a lot of things that maybe are easy to study in the lab, but are maybe less impactful in real life. So one of the things that we study a lot are gambles. Sometimes they're not even real gambles; they're just hypothetical gambles. Or we make people make hypothetical choices about medications. But this was a topic that was going to have really big impacts on people. So we decided we would do a study, a longitudinal study with a panel of people that we recruited from Amazon Mechanical Turk. So these are people that have signed up to do studies. And we'd had a lot of success doing studies with them in the past. We knew we could get a sample started right away. We knew that we would have good retention over 6 months. So it's not a representative sample, but it was, as far as I know, we're the first in the field that I've come across. We ran our first study in late February of 2020. And so we were just kind of checking in with people. We wanted to know, what are your thoughts about COVID-19? What have you heard about it? And we also asked about political ideology because we had a sneaking suspicion that, like it seemed everything else, political ideology might play a role in responses to this public health crisis. Our pre-registered hypothesis, though, was that we thought it would look a little bit more like Ebola or Zika, where it was the conservatives who were a little bit more concerned about this threat from outside, because conservatives are traditionally a little bit more concerned about threats from outgroups. So we thought, it's going to be the conservatives who are going to think that this is really bad. And it's going to be the liberals who are like, this doesn't matter. Who cares? And then, of course, what happened was Donald Trump very early on said it's a hoax. Who cares? We don't care about this. And so then it was kind of like an interesting, like real world, like on boots on the ground example of how, there are like things that we think conservatives do, like there's personality traits that are associated with conservatism. But when you have a political party that has like a really strong leader, sometimes what that leader says can trump everything else. And so what we ended up finding is that over the course of this period of time, conservatives were the ones that were less concerned than liberals. The second thing that we were really interested in for the particular paper that you found was this idea of what's been called motivated numeracy. And so there had been a few prior studies on in the political science domain. There's a finding that people that are higher in what's called cognitive sophistication tend to have ideas that are more politically aligned. So if you're higher in like vocabulary, or if you know more about politics and you identify as liberal, you're going to have a whole bunch of like liberal leaning attitudes. But there's a finding in decision making, this motivated numeracy finding, that people that have more ability with math problems are more likely to use those when reasoning about risk. And so in a politically motivated way. So people who are conservative and liberal can take kind of the same piece of information and draw different conclusions from it. And to the extent that they're more sophisticated in how they can use numbers, they're more prone to do that. So we were like, gosh, COVID-19, a lot of numbers. So how are these numbers? And early on, people were getting just sort of inundated with numbers. So we were really interested in, because, we care about the antecedents and consequences of numeracy. So we were like, this is going to be a numeracy story. We really did. And what ended up happening instead is, instead of numeracy, early on, we realized it was actually verbal ability, so vocabulary or skills with verbal analogies that was interacting with ideology in the way that we expected numeracy to. And so instead of, so people higher in numeracy instead had, lower risk perceptions, they had more accurate beliefs. And it was people who were higher in verbal ability or vocab performance that were, if they were conservative, they were, not worried at all. If they were liberal, they were very worried. And so this was really surprising to us, and also made us realize that all of this research about why political conservatives and liberals are more polarized when they are higher in ability, there was a lot missing. Like, why is that? We had assumed that it was because, if you have this cherished view, you're going to bring all of your cognitive resources to bear, and that would include numeracy. And then we didn't find that. And so where we've gone since then is trying to figure out, why that was the case. So why was it that verbal ability rather than numeracy played a role? So the next thing we did in this study is we thought, well, gosh, what could it be about verbal ability? So verbal ability is related to crystallized versus fluid intelligence. So crystallized intelligence is all about wisdom and how you accumulate wisdom. And so if you are higher in verbal ability, you tend to be more wise and more knowledgeable about a variety of topics. And how do you get wise about a variety of topics? Well, we thought maybe people that are higher in verbal ability, who are more wise, maybe they're consuming more media. And specifically, we thought that they might be more likely to consume polarized media. And that is exactly what we found. So people that were higher in verbal ability were more polarized in the news that they were consuming. So liberals who are higher in ability were much less likely to consume Fox News, for example. So that was one of these kind of mechanisms, is that, one of the reasons why, cognitive sophistication or cognitive ability leads to polarization is because they just have more reasons to believe the things that they're believing. We also wanted to see, though, what would happen if we give them, like had been done in other studies, like what happens if we give them some COVID-19 information that's kind of
neutral.
Yeah, like, are they going to be neutral about it, or are they going to kind of see it through
Immediately put it into which group? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so, I also wasn't willing to give up on numeracy yet, because we had, it's
Never
numbers,
change.
right? It has
Yeah.
to be numbers, because there's numbers. We're giving them numbers. They're drawing conclusions about numbers.
I like numbers. Everyone likes numbers. It's got to be numbers.
It should be numbers. Yeah, exactly. And so we gave them some information, some factual information. My favorite was, the CDC originally was estimating that there would be X number of deaths by the state. It turns out that there were Y number, a smaller number of deaths.
Thank you.
What do you attribute this? And so we had a scale from completely social distancing to completely the CDC overstated the risks. And as you are probably anticipating, liberals thought it was more likely that social distancing worked. Conservatives thought it was more likely that the CDC overstated the risks. And the people that were higher in verbal ability, not numeracy, were the ones that were more polarized on that item. And so it became clear that, even if you give people, and I think this is the thing that's really surprising for scientists, and the thing that is really interesting to me is, I think for political scientists, they kind of know that everybody sees through a political lens. But I think with COVID-19 and I think climate change as well, there's a frustration when you are communicating about, and public health officials, I think, we're not anticipating this whatsoever. You're a doctor, you give people medical information, they follow your advice. Like, I don't think that, anyone was expecting pushback that was politically motivated. And that is exactly what happened. Like the pushback became very polarized, like people were pushing back for different reasons, to different figures. But the idea is, for a lot of people, if you just give people information, it should reduce polarization, because you just give them the information. They're incorrect. One side is correct, one side is incorrect. You give them the information and it should solve polarization. And I think our data show that there's room to be cautious about that, because we found that the people that were most polarized were also more likely to take that same piece of information and draw, opposite conclusions. Because if you think about the example I just gave you, if you think that the CDC overstated the risks versus you think social distancing worked, if you see an increase in cases again, you're going to do two very different things. If you think the number of deaths was lower because social distancing works, well, then that means social distancing works and we should continue to do that. If you think it's because the CDC overstated the risks and there is fear mongering going on, then you're going to be really resistant to any further pressure to social distance. And I think that we're kind of getting, God, I thought like 2021, we published this paper. I'm still doing a little bit of COVID research. I thought like, oh, COVID seems like it's over. We probably won't do any more COVID research, but it's starting to like resurge a little bit. And it's perfect timing for this interview because we're starting to like dredge up the liberals are like, oh gosh, time to put my mask back on. And conservatives are like, what are you doing? This didn't work the first time around. It sure isn't going to work the second time.
There's just keep going.
No, that's really the
yeah.
story. The one other piece that we did is because I still wasn't ready to give up on numeracy because I was like, maybe
never change, Professor. Never change.
Call me Brittany.
Never change. Brittany. She gave me permission. Okay, yes. Mom, don't criticize me after the interview. She gave me permission. Okay.
Yes,
Brittany.
Please call me Brittany. Yeah. So. Because you always want, and I think this is reasonable. If you have a hypothesis going in, usually it's not out of thin air. You have a reason to expect it. And so when you get results that you don't expect, I think it's worth pushing back on them a little bit. And so we had done the push with the sample, but then, we hadn't looked at a different sample. And so I was aware of this great resource. It's called the Understanding America Study. It is done at the University of California, Dornschleife, and it is publicly available data.
USC.
It is a great resource, and they are so generous with this data, and they had a COVID panel. And their sample is nationally representative. Ours was a convenience sample, so it took them a little bit longer to get in the field. But they had really similar questions to the key things that we were interested in, which was people's risk perceptions. So we took a look at their panel, and not only did they have a really similar numeracy measure as we had, but they had additional measures of fluid intelligence. So fluid intelligence, the one that they used is like a number series. So you get the practice problem is something like 1, 3, 5, what fill in the blank. And so, the next one would be 7. And so they're number series. So it's not really a calculation, it's pattern recognition. So it's more of a fluid intelligence measure. And so we had, even more ability measures, a larger sample, a representative sample. And we could look at risk perceptions, and they did risk perceptions in a little bit different way. And wouldn't you know it, the exact same thing happened. It was actually the two. They had vocabulary and verbal analogies, and both of those were the ones that were driving polarization compared to numeracy. So then then I really gave up. Like maybe numeracy matters for some of these motivated processes, but where we've gone since is numeracy seems to be really tied to accuracy because it's people making calculations. And so a lot of times when you are making calculations, you're not going to necessarily go astray if you're higher in numeracy. We have other research that is involved in that. Sometimes you do go astray if you make too many comparisons or calculations, but that's a story for a different day. And cognitive ability, that's the verbal kind, like this motivated wisdom, that seems to be what is driving people to become more polarized. And we haven't really figured out still what it is in particular about verbal ability that lends itself to polarization. That's an ongoing research question, but at least for COVID-19, what we were able to do is say, hey, maybe people aren't finding this motivated numeracy effect because it's motivated, what we're calling motivated wisdom instead.
So just for the audience at home, let me try to summarize, I think, what I'm hearing. And then tell me if I got it wrong or right. Sure. For fabulous prizes. You would think that people who are very good at talking and rationalizing and being wise, and you would think that people who are good at studying numbers and data would see the data, would see the information, and would come to the most logical conclusion. And rather what you found was that doesn't matter how smart they are, doesn't matter how good at numbers they are, doesn't matter how wise they are, doesn't matter how good a talker they are. They still fall into two camps. And when you present impartial data, they go, okay, thanks for the impartial data. I'm going to now interpret it in a way that benefits my side. And you, as a professor, are being frustrated going, you guys are smart. Can't you pull yourself out of the box for a second and see that the data is the data? It's not partial data. Am I roughly summarizing this correctly?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a really good summary. And you hit on something that I think is worth following up on. Actually, two things that are worth following up on. First is that we tend to think especially because I think a lot of people these days are polarized, and Pew does a new survey every day, and God, people are getting further and further apart. And we tend to make really uncharitable attributions about people on the other side. We tend to think that they're closed-minded and stupid. And I think my research is important because it shows, or like the research I'm talking about today, which is not just me, it's a whole big, amazing team of people. But our research is really important because it shows that that is super incorrect. If you're talking about the people who are most diametrically opposed to you, they are the most intelligent people. And so treating them like they're stupid or assuming that they're stupid and then giving them really dumb arguments isn't going to persuade them. The second thing I think that it's important that you touched on that I think is really important is that idea of people are going to not come to a communication as if they're a blank slate. And so they're going to bring to bear all of their past knowledge, so that when a conservative looks at a graph, and you could even see this, I think, with some of the comparisons that people were making to the flu. So, you can make a comparison to the flu, and or you could make, and compared to the flu, COVID is a lot more deadly. But in terms of the absolute risk, for a lot of people, it doesn't feel like it's that much more deadly. So you go from is that absolute
We're
risk
not allowed to
risk?
say that. I
Are we not?
remember when people were saying that in the middle of COVID. How dare you compare it in any way to the flu? We need to ban you, shut down your channel, make sure that you're humiliated, and you're never allowed to speak on social media. I have 5 friends who said things about COVID during COVID, had all their social media shut down, told they were stupid, and then after COVID came out, was over, the science totally backed them up. And yet there was no apology about shutting them down for saying it earlier, and none of their accounts were restored. Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
Democracy. It's called democracy and freedom democracy, if you weren't aware. So where do we go from here? The smart people, the logical people, the numerical counter people, the philosophical people, the intelligent people. It doesn't matter if you appeal to that. It doesn't matter if you find the smartest people in the room. And it doesn't matter if you try to say, hey, come on, can't we all work together? They still seem to be tribal. How do we undo that?
Yeah, so there's some research that that has come out really recently that I think is helpful, and I haven't done follow-up research to find out if it's the people, because I'm also talking about this subpopulation that I expect to be very, very resistant because they're smarter, right? So they're going to be better able to counter argue. They come with more knowledge, so they're going to be a little bit harder to change on average. But there's been some really interesting work that's come out recently where they have you heard about the Facebook echo chambers, and people are all up in arms, well, you go on Facebook and you never are exposed to other viewpoints. And so of course you become more polarized because you never see the other side. And so there are some studies that have been done where they basically manipulated the algorithms, or they actually assign people to have conversations with people from different sides. Do you remember when we used to be able to do that? And people didn't immediately freak out, oh my God, you don't believe what I believe, I'm unfriending you and blocking you.
I agree. There is a lot of evidence of echo chambers on social media. There's a lot of professors in political polarization and a lot of the media and a lot of politicians who will say it's social media, it's the algorithms tearing us apart, and they're making us more aggressive and tribal. However, there is another group of professors in this field who say, I'm not so sure. Mm-hmm. Their opinion goes something like this: I'm already polarized, so I'm just going to go find news sources that back that up. And hey, if Facebook does a great job, I'm staying there. Versus I went to Facebook, I wasn't polarized, and Facebook made me polarized. There seems to be a debate on were these people searching it out beforehand, or were they impartial, passive, tabula rasa people, blank slates, and then the evil algorithms turned them into a monster.
Oh, and I'm saying Facebook
It's a
echo
debate.
chambers.
It's a debate.
I don't know enough about how Facebook algorithms work to say that they are like doing something nefarious behind the scenes. I'm just simply saying that I know a lot of people would unfollow people who are saying political things that they disagreed with, and Facebook doesn't have anything to do with that. They're not making that decision. The person is doing that. And so it could be completely self-curated, and you can create your own echo chamber just by, like unfollowing people that, in fact, I did that the other day. Somebody posted something I didn't like in their Facebook feed, and I was like, oh, like, I don't want to see political. My problem is I don't want to see any political things at all. So I was getting rid, but it has the same effect, right? Because then I'm only seeing things that are like people's food and their pictures of their kids on their first day of school.
But professor, didn't you prove the point? You saw something you didn't want to see.
Exactly.
And your first reaction was not, let me read it, let me get to know it better. Yep. It's bad, wrong, get away from me.
I don't want to, I didn't have my really critical thinking hat on at that moment. Exactly.
How does this happen? You're really smart, you're good at thinking, you're good at numbers, and you did it yourself.
Right. Yeah, because we don't have the cognitive resources to be thinking critically about every single thing. And so I think that's why some people have raised the alarm that when we're never ever exposed, and people self-sort into physical locations, so there's like a city versus town or city versus country mentality even, where if you want, I remember I was living in Columbus, and I'm from a small town. I'm the thing behind me is a picture of the farm my dad grew up on. And so I'm from a really small area. There were 80 people in my graduating class. You couldn't bring your tractor to school day because the parking lot was full of tractors. And so when we moved to Columbus and I was in graduate school, I can't remember which election it was, but we didn't know, my husband and I, everyone that we were friends with in Columbus was voting for the Democratic candidate. And then everyone we were friends with back home was voting for the Republican. And so it was really interesting to see, like, we had this like moment where we're like, who are you going to vote for? And we were like, obviously, whoever it was, probably Obama. And then they were like, what? Anyone who's voting for Obama. And we were just, we were both sides were kind of like, what has happened? And so
you saw polarization firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think we see a lot of it. But I have also seen things that give me hope. And that's why I was mentioning social media. So there was a ballot issue in Ohio that would have made it more difficult for citizens to change the Constitution. And it wasn't exactly, so there were some prominent conservative groups who actually came out against it. But the current administration that is in power, that is conservative, was kind of responsible for putting it forward. And there was a lot of discussion on Nextdoor. I don't know if you, Nextdoor is like, I saw a raccoon, I'm selling
but it's turning political.
Dresser. And then also, by the way, here's this like big political issue we're going to discuss on Nextdoor.
Yeah, COVID-19 was all over Nextdoor.
Yes, exactly.
Because they couldn't talk about it anywhere else.
Yes, I think so. And the thing about Nextdoor that's really interesting is that it doesn't seem to have it doesn't seem to have the things, it doesn't have a feed like Facebook does, where like people aren't posting pictures on there. Right. And so for whatever reason, at least in my town, there was more crosstalk between people that identified with different political parties. And it was really interesting to see people kind of give rational arguments and engage. And so that's why, so I'm not saying that social media is negative. I'm saying that, when we force people to get out of their echo chambers, it seems to be having a benefit. And it was, refreshing to see people have, measured arguments and respect each other's opinions. And I think people became less polarized on the issue as a result. At least people weren't we're moralizing. So one of my friends is Andy Luttrell, and he studies how attitudes become moral issues, and that is something that can make them very difficult to change. And so when you see moralizing language, I think that's usually like a red flag. And so it was nice to see, and that with that particular ballot issue, we have abortion and marijuana on the ballot for November. So I doubt we'll see the kinds of reasoned arguments in a few months. But at least for this very specific one, there wasn't a lot of moralizing language. And so it felt like people were able to come together on the facts. I think that's another thing that we should bring up with respect to polarization is I think when scientists are communicating about the science that is relevant to politically polarized topics, or doctors are communicating, we tend to think that people have based their attitudes on facts as we see facts, like a truth that you can, like, we did a study, we found a thing, and there's only one interpretation of that thing. And I think it leaves out a lot of we already talked about how people can come to different interpretations through the lens of their ideology, but also people come with, it isn't just science that matters to people. There are also moral values that matter to people. And so I think in some cases you might have like sacred values. So I think for a lot of conservatives, polarization on the basis of like science communication is going to be really difficult with something like abortion, because for them, it's not a scientific issue. It's not, right. It's a moral issue. And so giving them statistics about, well, it reduces, oh gosh, there's so many arguments. Like it reduces the number of unwanted pregnancies in the future. I've seen a link between abortion and juvenile delinquency. There's all these things that you can say.
Sure.
And those are really besides the point for conservatives, because that's a moral issue for them. And so there's some work out of the lab I was in as a graduate student that's looked at moral versus non-moral arguments. And when you're trying to persuade someone, you want to make sure that you're matching. So if somebody has a moral attitude and you give them, you can even seem like very, very like callous, I think. So if somebody has this very moralized view and then you're giving them kind of like scientific research evidence, it can also come across as like really cold and clinical. And so I think that's an issue that we haven't gotten into with this line of research at all, just from other work that I'm aware of, that I think is something that if we're going to reduce polarization, we're also going to have to understand where the polarization is coming from. Is it a matter of, political parties in the United States now really get their news from wildly different sources? So they're now basically having two bodies of knowledge. So like reality is different from them. So that's one issue. But the second issue is moralizing. And I think like it's going to be tricky to figure out a way to get past both of those things.
Right. If I may. So the debate now seems to be, I have an opinion on transgendered people. You must hate them all. Okay. Yeah. You must hate them all and want them all dead, just like the Nazis. I didn't say that. I don't care what you said. I know that's how you feel. There's a lot of that going on these days. That's not helpful, is what you're saying, I think.
Yep. And that's one of the, so when we talk about groups, and this isn't my research, this is something, I teach an intro to social psychology class. So this is like really basic social psychology research. When we talk about groups polarizing, one of the things that can lead to polarization is exactly what you're saying. Like one group is interpreting or kind of projecting what the attitude of the other group is. And so if you think that the attitude of the other group is very extreme, then that justifies you becoming more extreme, because they're already more extreme. And so there's been some really, really interesting work. And again, this is about like interacting with people that don't have the same views as you. Deep canvassing is what it's called. And you brought up trans people, which made me think of it. So you might have somebody who's trans talk to people, and then people realize that maybe their ideas are incorrect. But the same thing can happen with people who belong to different political parties. You get exposed to somebody's idea and assuming it's less extreme, right? It all goes out the window if we're talking about like people that are super extreme. But like the average person, you might find out, oh wow, they're actually much less extreme than I thought that they were, and we do have this common ground. There's
a lot of studies that show that the more polarized groups get towards each other, the more likely they are to attribute extreme attitudes to the other group. So the more polarized Democrats and Republicans are, the more likely Democrats are to think Republicans will believe the most extreme beliefs, and Republicans think Democrats will believe the most extreme beliefs. Like one side hates America and wants us to be destroyed, and the other side hates all minorities and wants slavery to return. And, both, I think, seem extreme attitudes, and you have a lot of people holding those opinions. It makes it difficult to have a conversation when you think the other person's Hitler, I would imagine.
Yeah, well, and I've seen, yes, a lot of discussion gets completely derailed once you bring out Hitler.
I'm just saying that it's you're a racist, you're a bigot, you're a sexist, you hate America, you're a communist, you love, the enemy. It's just extreme language rather than saying you have a difference of opinion and I may not agree with it, but let me find out more what that is.
I also think it's really interesting that you meant the language that you're using is all about emotions. So I think that we also like to think that, and I'd like to go here next with my research. I would imagine that smarter people, their attitudes and beliefs are just as much based on emotions as people who have lower cognitive ability.
Yeah.
But I would imagine that they have the perception, and maybe I should say we have the perception. I shouldn't talk about like humans like they're aliens. And like, here I am. I'm not polarized. But I would imagine people that are higher in cognitive ability think that all of their attitudes are based on facts, based on science, and not as much based on emotion. And so I wonder if part of this inability for people to depolarize is that there's an assumption that my beliefs are due to the way that the world is and should be, and you are using your irrational emotions. And so, and I think that that's like a really interesting way to think of, like, yeah, it is kind of what people are saying. They're saying like the other side isn't just extreme, but they're also like very emotion based rather than, it's not, I'm trying to think of it. It's hard to even think, I think, of extreme beliefs that aren't super emotional.
I mean, that's what I see.
Well, let's set like a 90% tax rate on billionaires, right? Like, so that would be really extreme. But I think people, if you said that, people would be like, you hate billionaires. That would be like the way to condense it and like dismiss it. And then of course, if you believe one side hates billionaires, then you're maybe going to like respond with, being condescending or giving them information that they already know. Instead of trying to see both sides. I've noticed another thing. There's not a whole lot of research on this, very, very little, but there's this idea of when people have an attitude and they're maybe defensive about it. Because the other thing I study is reactance to messaging. So I'm going to flip from politically motivated attitudes to tobacco or distracted drivers. And so when you have this idea, like, so you're a smoker, you might be really defensive because you kind of know that smoking isn't good for you, but you're also kind of really sick of people telling you that smoking isn't good for you because you know smoking isn't good for you. So, but you probably have some reason for smoking. No one's like, oh my God, I hate this. And so there's, yeah, exactly. So there's a suggestion that if you acknowledge the reasons why somebody might want to do something that's bad for them, or in the case of a political argument, you might acknowledge that there's both sides and both sides are valid. But here's what I think, and be a little bit less gentle rather than like really kind of firm and harsh, that makes people who are holding these values or attitudes or beliefs that are really important to them, it makes them a little bit more open, because no one likes to hear that their attitudes are stupid.
Thank you. recognizing the other side has some points.
Otherwise, we wouldn't be polarized, right? How on earth do we get polarized?
Well, thank you.
It's the people that are higher in ability that get polarized if only one side has any value.
If I could, real quick, I'm glad that you brought this up. First, I wanted to say, did another interview with another professor, and they said the exact same thing.
Yeah.
We were studying college-educated people, and they thought, well, college-educated people should not be polarized, right? Because they're trained to think, and that was not the evidence at all. What they found was that the intelligent people are worse because they think there's no chance they could be polarized or influenced, and yet they are just as likely to shut down their intellectual parts of their brain to fit into their tribe as all other humans. And it's even worse because they're not aware they're doing it.
And maybe they're better at it.
And maybe they're better. Yeah. And the other part is, I've been saying this was my strategy that I've been slowly coming to in this interview series as to how to reduce polarization. I remember Hillary Clinton saying, you can have your own opinion, but you can't have your own facts. And for me, it seems there's separate sets of facts. I talked to a lot of conservatives, I talked to a lot of liberals. They are absolutely not aware of gigantic facts that the other side knows. And from talking to them, I've realized there's a bunch of facts liberals know that are true. There's a bunch of facts conservatives know that are true. Neither side knows those sets of facts. So we can't have any common conversation at all. And I thought, what if we just had 3 agreed upon facts in America, that all liberals and all conservatives said, let's not try to fix everything, but just 3 basic facts that we don't even have one. And I thought if we just had 3, maybe that's a move in the right direction. And
yeah. I mean, I don't have a quick answer for you. I mean, it used to be that marijuana legalization is becoming more mainstream. So I mean, maybe that's an agreed. Yeah.
But you can look at abortion and immigration, and those are old school issues, and they're not.
Yeah, but I think those also come back down to sacred values about fairness and respect for people. And so I think maybe the facts in those cases are what counts as a person or what counts as a citizen. And then it's really difficult to get people because then it's like this, it's like a sacred value, right? So if you're conservative, then a fetus is a person that's sacred. Right. And if you're a liberal, then, people have a right to autonomy, and that's sacred. And so I think that might be why those issues are just so difficult to get people to come to agreement on. So I've seen arguments like, well, if you increase access to birth control, it decreases the number of abortions that people might have. But if you think that even Plan B is immoral because, there was a fertilized embryo and that fertilized embryo is a person, then, people don't like to compromise on their sacred values. And so that's another example of people, you're trying to use facts, and maybe facts is the wrong word. I think there's a lot of things that we treat as facts, maybe that that can't be true or can't be conclusively proven true.
Fair. I thought but
they feel like they're true. I
just thought, for the big example that comes to mind is obviously Joseph Biden won the election. I think there were some discrepancies in Arizona, but I don't think it was enough to cost the election. Obviously, he won. So we got to get Republicans to accept that he won the election. The Stop the Steal thing is garbage. At the same time, there's a federal report called the Durham Report. It's on the Department of Justice webpage. It has not been refuted by anybody. It's been up there for a year. And it basically says there was no evidence that Trump colluded with the Russians. I mean, maybe he did some bad business deals. Maybe he talked to them, but I consciously will work with you to rig the American system to top of that. Never happened. It was all made up by Hillary Clinton and her staffers, and they passed the dossier to the FBI, who abused the FISA process. This is on the Department of Justice, federal government's official webpage, and it was backed up by CNN. And yet when I talk to liberals, they won't admit it. And yet when I talk to conservatives, they won't admit that Stop the Steal is wrong. And I thought, what if we had in America where you guys admit that was garbage, and you guys admit that was garbage, and all of us have to admit that we're we can make mistakes. And that all of us are human, and we need to work harder at listening to the other side and recognizing that we too can get it wrong. And I thought, if we had a country like that, maybe we'd be better off, because right now what we have is, I'm right, I'm awesome, you're stupid and wrong because you're evil. And there is zero agreement on anything. I thought, 3 facts where we could do that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
Am I wildly crazy for thinking that?
I don't think so. And again, this isn't an area of research that I do, but there's an idea called intellectual humility. So you can be super, super smart, but if you have the idea that you might be wrong, and so like I hate to toot my own horn, but like me with like the numeracy, like I might be wrong. I need to like, this seems weird. I need to like, before I publicize these findings, before I put them into the public record, I need to like really carefully dot my I's and cross my T's and make sure that, because I can be wrong. Like in fact, I work in a lab that collaborated on the first research that found motivated numeracy. And so like, and this was a project that we already were wrong about, because we thought conservatives were going to be the ones that were more concerned about COVID. Sure. And so I think, I don't know how to foster more intellectual humility, but it seems to me like that's a good place to start. Like, what can we do with the K through 12 education? I mean, we teach critical thinking, but I don't know that we do a lot. We teach kids to like question the information that's coming from the outside in, like question what you see on the internet, question what public figures might be saying, but do we do a good job? I don't know, of telling kids like, hey, you might be wrong about something. Like, that's why you need to be searching out this information in the first place. And I think, scientists get it beaten into us because we submit something for peer review and then it turns out that we were really, really wrong about everything.
But that's awesome though, because that allows us to trust science. That's about science is that you scientists, hey, I check my assumptions, great, and I'm willing to be wrong, great. And that's the only reason we have any technological, scientific, medical progress in, right? Or what if we just kept thinking, previous doctor said smoking doesn't cause cancer, let's just go with that.
Yep.
Why challenge assumptions? That's not science.
Yeah. And I think that might be why, like, so one of the things we did, and it isn't in the paper that we're looking at today, but we did look at trust in various sources of information about COVID-19. And one, I think, shining beacon of hope was that, each side didn't really trust the other side. So conservatives don't trust Trump, liberals didn't trust CNN or Biden, but both sides did trust doctors, and they trusted scientists, and they trusted the CDC at first. There's a little bit of polarization with the CDC after a while, but for the most part, there's trust in these groups. I mean, you see exceptions to that. So I think there's a little bit of distrust of climate scientists within like the climate change domain, and you can see there's some distrust, I think, of people who study vaccines. There was a lot of backlash against the COVID-19 vaccine. And, it's new technology. It makes people nervous. It will probably become more as it becomes like, well, I don't know. I hate to make a prediction and then be immediately wrong, because what has happened with the COVID-19 vaccine is we've seen an ideological divide in terms of other vaccinations. So conservatives have been getting a little bit more vaccines skeptical in general, not just with respect to COVID-19 vaccines. Right. So I was going to say, well, and then after a while, it'll just be like common practice, common knowledge, and we'll just accept it because it's been there for a while. But I don't want to say that because I don't know exactly which way the wind will blow.
Well, I certainly vaccines are important and et cetera. But, when we're looking at the hesitancy, I understand Donald Trump was horrible on COVID-19. He downplayed the threat. He said, why close anything? Let's keep everything open. He suggested that people drink bleach or something. It was just beyond stupid. At the same time, there were these people called Joseph Biden and Kamala Harris who, before they were elected, said, hell no, I'll never take any vaccine made by Trump.
Oh,
They said
geez.
it publicly on television. Then when they were elected, they went on TV and said, take the vaccine.
Oh, that's so weird. I didn't know Trump was making any vaccines.
So he was starting underneath him, and then it continued under Biden. The Biden administration also, I'm not making this up, lied when they said there was no rollout of vaccines until I got here. There's actually one seamless federal process that went from Trump through Biden because these are lower federal agencies. And so it started with Trump, processed through Biden. And though it was kind of the same people and the same doctors working on it, when Trump was in charge, Biden and Harris both went on television and said, no, no, no. And then when they were in charge, they go, oh, yeah, take the vaccine. That might cause some people to be skeptical. Like, why was the vaccine bad when the other guy was making it, but now it's good when you make it? The other thing was, I remember Sanjay Gupta on CNN had to admit CNN was dead wrong when they went after Joe Rogan on hydroxychloroquine. Don't take my word for it. Sanjay Gupta, the main doctor on CNN, basically goes, yeah, you got a point, Joe. And then he tried walking it back. That does not build credibility. Additionally, when the CDC says, stay home, practice social distancing, oh, there's a George Floyd protest. Okay, everybody go out into the streets and protest, and it'll be cool. That doesn't make any sense. And so when people see this, they go, is this political, or is this based on science? Like the social distancing thing is actually, science said 12 feet. We went with 6 feet for politics. That's not science. These are reasonable reasons to be a little skeptical, no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I don't know. I don't know about the hydroxychloroquine because I'm not an expert on.
Sanjay
So
Gupta,
I don't know. I don't know if it's real or not.
Sure.
So I can't speak to those issues. But I think like one of the things that we have to be careful of, and God, can you imagine how frustrating it must have been to be one of those doctors in the CDC who's like quietly working on vaccine rollout, and then you're depending on which way the political wind blows, you're the hero or the villain. Gosh, that must be tricky. I will say that like all of these examples that you're giving of people of increased polarization are politicians making comments. And so there was a great study that came out around the maybe 2022 that found that when people were mainly listening to scientists, the polarized response was diminished, at least in terms of COVID-19. So if you're getting most of your advice from doctors and scientists, there was more agreement between conservatives and liberals. And I believe that the study was across countries. But then if you were getting your advice from politicians, that's when things were becoming more polarized. And so I think that's an important thing to note, is that these are examples of politicians making public health statements, and maybe our politicians shouldn't be making public health statements.
That makes sense to me. Maybe
they should be not doing that, or saying, hey, let's listen to doctors and scientists. It seems like that's helpful if we let doctors and scientists, although, then we go back to the problem that we started with at the top of this conversation, which is if it's something that's related to like a really strongly held political belief, you might reach completely different conclusions depending on your political lens. But I think something like a call to action is a little bit different. So, and I have two reasons to say that. One is that we looked at political misinformation, which is like just a footnote in this paper. Wasn't a very important finding whatsoever, in terms of like the really surprising part, which was this greater polarization among people who were high in verbal ability across, and the motivated reasoning and the selective exposure to media. But we found that people that were higher in verbal ability were less likely to endorse political misinformation, whether it was, pro-liberal or pro-conservative. And I think a really clear statement that is unambiguous might reduce polarization. So if you say the science says 12 feet and you're a scientist, and then, the public health department says, hey, the science says 12 feet. I wonder if that might be something that reduces polarization because it's so unambiguous. Because we know that motivated reasoning and bias is easier when things are ambiguous. And so I wonder if like some really clear recommendations, and I think that's one of the problems with the CDC is part of the issue is that the science was evolving, but I think the public really interpreted it as ambiguous recommendations.
Well, I mean, Fauci said don't wear a mask, and then he said do wear masks, and people
Yeah.
died when he said that, literally. So I would
Yep.
think that could cause some fear.
Yeah, I think so. So
And if I
there's
lost
this,
a family member because
yeah.
Fauci incorrectly said don't wear a mask, I'd be mad for a long time.
But you know, we have to. That's outcome bias. So we have to go with the information that we have available at the time. And
Sure.
so that's one of the problems I think that people have with science. It's one of the reasons people become anti-science is that sometimes like the like common knowledge or like the thing that everybody agrees on turns out to be like not exactly true.
Sure.
And that can really be upsetting. Like, and I think as scientists, we're kind of used to like our pet ideas being wrong. So we don't realize like how upsetting it can be to the public who like that part. Like I have a son in 5th grade. The part of like, man, scientists are wrong a lot is completely missing from his science book. They give them experiments to do where you already know, like you have the hypothesis, and guess what? The hypothesis is going to turn out exactly as you expected it to because they led you to the right hypothesis.
Right.
And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with 5th grade education. He's getting really well educated, but I also think like, man, at some point it would be nice if we could like help people understand that a little bit better. That Fauci wasn't doing that because he wanted people to die. He was making a recommendation based on the information he had at the time. And then it turned out that was wrong. And maybe there's some communication strategies that could have been used to communicate that better. Like maybe every time he said wear a mask, he could have been like, this is new information that we have that we didn't have before. We previously said don't wear a mask, and now we're realizing that was wrong and people should be wearing a mask, and here's why.
That's not what he would do. He would say, this is what it is, and it's the law,
right.
and everybody should follow it. And he's also admitted he wasn't sure if not wearing masks was the right thing. There was an ongoing debate, and he took a stance. You know, and we look at people, and he's admitted that. And so when I go to a skeptic and they go, well, these doctors guess, and they guess wrong sometimes. Yeah. Well, Fauci literally admitted that.
Yep.
Literally. So it's hard to go to a skeptic and go, you should buy what the doctors say. Well, sometimes the doctors go, I don't know, there's a debate. It's blue. Whoops, I was wrong. It's red. And then I go, well, see, you should have no skepticism of the doctors, and you should be cool with but he admitted he made a guess. And people died from it. Wouldn't it be a little bit hard to have that much faith in scientists when the scientists occasionally go, hey, I was guessing, bro. Whoops.
It'd be nice if they said, and I feel like I've been pretty clear about when I'm guessing versus when I have. And so I think that, so I do a little bit of work in medical decision making too, and I think this is one of the areas that's really interesting to me is so like side effects, right? Like so we've done some studies on communicating side effects to people, and it's part of informed consent. So, you know, like from my perspective, the decision I made was that the COVID vaccine was efficacious enough and the side effects were either mild or so rare that it was the right decision for me. But I used the statistics. And so, you know, I am really numerate, but there are ways. We actually did a study where we investigated how best to communicate to people so that they would be able to understand better side effects and make a good decision. And so I think that if scientists and doctors are maybe communicating uncertainty a little bit better, then a lot of these issues kind of resolve themselves. And so I think that maybe is the issue with Fauci. Like if he would have said, this is an ongoing, you know, the science is ongoing in this in this domain right now. And we have concerns about availability of PPE for medical personnel. So right now we're not making the recommendation, right? If he would have said that, I don't think that there would have been as much backlash. it's not really, I wouldn't advocate if you're a scientist or doctor listening right now, please don't guess and then wait for the outcome to like blow up in your face and then be like, oh, whoops, there was some uncertainty there that I didn't communicate. Like you can communicate uncertainty even to people who are lower in numeracy. Yep, that's a thing. We can, they do, like people lower in numeracy, they're more influenced by the format and the way that you present the information, but you can still present information to them.
Sure.
And so I think that's like a really important aspect, I think, that gets left out of the conversation sometimes.
Trust in a public disaster is exceptionally important, especially if you need the public to pay attention for a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
When we were in World War II, America is very different from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in that it would let its people know when we lost a battle. The other forces never did that. And what that did was build a lot of trust between the American people and their government, mm-hmm. that although people were dying and it was tough, we were doing the right thing and we need to hold out for the remaining 4 years because Roosevelt cut it to him straight. We didn't get that with COVID-19. Maybe that's why we didn't get the same level of trust for a commensurate period.
Yeah. Yep. And we'll be dissecting COVID-19 for years and years and years. I was like, this one study, man, and we did this NSF, and I remember being in Ellen Peters' office, and we were like, I wonder if this is like even like we had just put the second survey in the field, and we ended up doing I think 5 or 6 waves, and we were like, I wonder if this is gonna fizzle out like Ebola did, and then like the second wave will be the only one that's useful. And then I got on a plane and I went home and it's been 4 years and I still haven't been in person in Oregon.
I'm guilty too. When COVID hit the first 2 weeks ago, this is going to be bird flu. We already did a bird flu. Yeah. We'll get through this. And, we never saw it on that level. Also, for everybody watching, check out Dr. Lena Wen. Her name is Dr. Lena Wen. I'll just say she was a media darling on all the cable news shows during COVID, and now she's a pariah on all those same cable news shows. Although she was an outstanding doctor before, now she's a horrible person. I'll leave it there. You can find out why for yourself. Well, the question for you is, last thing, you personally saw polarization in your small town during the Obama presidency, I think you were saying? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I was saying, my husband and I, from being in grad school in Columbus, didn't know anyone who wasn't voting for Obama. And then when we came back to our small hometown, they were like, what? You're voting for Obama? We don't know anyone who's voting for Obama. Yeah.
What year was that, roughly? Was that the first term, second term? First term Obama, second term Obama?
Man, you're really putting me on the spot. Like, okay, I have to think, like, how old am I? What years were Obama?
Okay, never mind. I'm sorry. What state?
Ohio.
Ohio. Okay, yep. So you were at a college town, and then you went back home to Ohio, and everybody's like, Obama?
No, it's even more extreme than that. So I live in my hometown, which has 25,000 people in Ohio. And I went to grad school 35 minutes up the road in Columbus. And it only took a 35-minute drive to go from everybody's voting for Obama to everybody's voting for, I don't remember who. But
wow.
Yep. Yeah, it's very much, Ohio is so interesting because the cities are very blue and the rural area is very red. And so we live in a rural area and we work in Columbus. So polarization is where I live every day.
That's fascinating because I've heard that Ohio is one of the last truly purple states. There's lots of red and lots of blue, and you can't go, this is just a red state. This is just a blue state. It's hard to tell. That's what I've heard. I'm not from there. I don't know.
Yep. Mm-hmm. I think we've gotten more red, at least if you look at the presidential elections. But yeah, I wouldn't say that we're solidly red. We're also one of those states that has some gerrymandering, so it's a little bit difficult to use like the makeup of the state legislature. But if you look at just like percentages of counties that go for Republicans or Democrats, yep. Interesting place to live.
I have a buddy who moved out there and he seems to love it. I'm like, he's from California, but he loves Ohio. And I know Dave Chappelle moved out there too, right? Isn't
Yeah,
Dave
Yellow
Chappelle
Springs.
Yeah,
Yep.
no, right. Yeah. That's the only famous person I know for you guys. Sorry, that's
Yep, that's fine.
No comment on Dave Chappelle. I'm just acknowledging that he lives there. I didn't say anything about him, good or bad. I just said he lives there. Okay. Last two questions for you. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third person watching this video. Wow, did they learn a lot? A lot of information. Oh my God, intellectual, smart people can be biased and human like the rest of us. Who knew? They're shocked. But then they're thinking back over this video and they're struggling to remember everything you said. But it's 5 days after they watched this video, and there's one thing that the professor said that they can't get out of their head. What is that one thing you want a viewer of this video you'll never meet to not be able to get out of their head? 5 days after watching this video on the psychology of political polarization.
It's the most polarized people are the smartest people. So when you come across somebody that disagrees with you, do not assume that they are stupid. And maybe if you're very smart and very polarized, maybe you're the person that needs to like think about the other side for a little bit.
Woo! That's definitely going to get some people right there. But that's why we do the show, to learn. I constantly have my ignorant assumptions checked, and I feel better for it. Trying to learn and understand this problem better.
If you're correct, then considering the other side should not change your mind. So what do you have to lose?
That's two brilliant thoughts. So you get the winner. Normally we get one. I think one person came up with 3. So you're second place.
Okay. Yeah.
Round prize. Yeah.
That's all the brilliance I have for today.
Well, we'll see. Well, we're interviewing more professors. We'll see if someone gets more comments. They'll win the $1 million prize at the end. But otherwise, it might go to you. Last question. I hope you found this was a fair interview. We didn't put words in your mouth. It was kind of a fair. Is there anyone you know who might be willing to be part of an honest conversation? They can be an activist. They could be a friend. They could be a professor. Anybody who might be willing to talk about political polarization. You don't have to name anybody at all.
Yeah.
What we always ask, we try to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, absolutely. If you email me, I'll give you a few recommendations.
Done. I will email you shortly with a copy of the video and asking for recommendations, and we'll leave it there.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Professor, for coming out. I appreciate your time. I know you're busy, and I want to say thank you for your time, and I'll send you a copy of the video shortly. And this was a lot of fun for me.
Yeah, it was good. It was good fun for me too. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, and goodbye to everybody in Ohio, and I'll email you shortly.
Thanks. Bye.